Hi again. I had intended to record and put out this video before the previous one, but I figured that this topic might appear to be a little bit negative or morose, which it isn't, to be honest, but I wouldn't be surprised if people think it is. I should really learn to look at the lens of the camera instead of admiring myself in the viewer. But anyway, so my subject and what will probably be the title of this video is this: death is nothing to us. This is not an original thought process. It's not something I've come up with myself. I mean, this statement or this phrase is not something I've come up with myself. To be frank, I don't really think that any thought of anybody in the world is truly original. But that's a discussion for another time. This is just a fascinating philosophy that I came across sometime last year when I was reading about Epicureanism. And I just want to take one aspect of Epicureanism which particularly interested me. Now, before I start, let me just talk about causation. Our actions in the present are guided by our experiences of the past. In other words, the past causes the present. I think that's quite straightforward to understand and for us to agree upon. However, causation can also be thought to occur backward in time, because our fears and worries in the future can cause us to behave a certain way right now, or can cause our actions in the present. Therefore, fear and worry play an important part in deciding human behavior. The ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, after whom Epicureanism was named, obviously, had several interesting things to say, especially about fear. His aim in life was to consistently attain a state of being where he had no fears, no pain, no discomfort, no worries. And this condition, he likened it to the serene calmness of the gods. And this state is what the Greeks called Ataraxia. It's a word that was later anglicized to Ataraxia. It's not a very common word. It's a little difficult to define, to be honest, but it is a word that exists. And Epicurus was not the only one who explored the concept of Ataraxia. I have read a little bit about other schools of philosophy, such as those of the Pyrrhonists and the Stoics, who they also pursued ataraxia in a manner different from Epicurus. Pyrrho, in fact, Pyrrho, Pyrrho, he was actually the one who coined the term ataraxia in the first place. But I think Stoicism and Epicureanism were and still are more popular. I think Stoicism is sort of regaining some popularity these days. It's kind of a social media trend somehow. We have people calling themselves Stoics on YouTube and Instagram. I don't think they really know what it means. I think that they think being Stoic just means being dignified, which it doesn't. Being Stoic kind of means being dignified, but being a Stoic, being a follower and a preacher of Stoicism, does not just mean being dignified. And I can say with certainty that a person who spends hours and days of their life recording and editing a video with makeup and lighting and retakes and whatnot is most probably not a Stoic. Anyway, that's something I'll leave for another time. Let me get back on track to Epicureanism. Among other things, Epicurus sought to dispel two primary fears which plagued the people at the time. One is the fear of the gods. I say gods because the Greeks did not follow a monotheistic view of religion. And the second was the fear of death. The second one is of particular interest because even today, you can try this out. You can type out a Google search, what do people fear? And most of the resultant articles will cite the fear of death as very high up on the list. Most of them, fear of death is going to be somewhere near the top. And it may be of relevance to think about this concept and see what Epicureanism has to say about it, just for our knowledge. Because I'm not necessarily suggesting that this is the right way to think about death, or that it's the best way to think about death. I'm just saying that it's worth thinking about. Epicurus believes that it makes no sense to fear something that isn't bad. Okay, and he is of the firm opinion that death is not a bad thing. And he proved this by postulating that good and bad are perceived by us through our senses and through our mental faculties. And if we were dead, then we would not have those senses, we would not have those mental faculties, therefore we cannot perceive good and bad, therefore nothing would mean anything anymore. Right? So he says death, even though it is not particularly a good thing, it is not a desirable thing, of course, but it is also not a bad thing. To paraphrase his own words, death is nothing to us. Right? He's the one who said this. If I am, then death is not. If death is, then I am not. Right? So his prime argument is this: why must we fear something if there is no point in time where you coexist with it? And at first glance, it seems like a solid argument, and it made me wonder how on earth anyone could continue to maintain a fear of death when it is so obviously illogical. But the thing is, when people say that they fear death, I don't think anyone actually really means death. So the very next thought in my mind was, what do we really mean when we say death? It's not just a state of being dead, but it's also, the way we use it is that we also talk about the process of dying, however long that takes. That is also death, and our fear is the anticipation of that process of dying rather than death itself. And it turns out that Epicurus had an answer ready for this argument. If death is nothing bad, which he already proved that death itself is not bad, then why would anyone be afraid of a future death as well? And he says this is even worse, right? He says it's foolish to be afraid of a not really bad thing, which is in the future, which is not even now. And when he puts it like that, it's hard to find a real argument against this. You sort of want to agree with it because you cannot really think of anything against it. And I have been introspecting for quite a while now and putting myself in the place of someone who says death is to be feared. Okay, like assume there is someone who's arguing, yes, we should fear death. Let's put themselves in their shoes and think, what might I actually be afraid of? Okay, and I have come to the understanding that it is in fact three other things that we might really be afraid of, and these three things are they that accompany death. Okay, so let me take you down my stream of thought and let's see if any of these can counter his statement. Number one, we fear losing our memories and our loved ones and all of the experiences that we have collected over the course of our life, right? And I do have this fear. We all have this fear at some point, right? And I understand where it comes from. However, I find that fearing this is just as illogical as fearing death itself, because the sensory perception and the awareness that is necessary, which is requisite for this loss of memory and experiences to be a bad thing, those sensory perceptions do not exist anymore. It's the same argument as before, right? So that's point number one, sort of dispelled right off the bat. And coming to the point number two, we fear that we may not lead a very fulfilled life because maybe an earlier death, since it would give us less time on earth, therefore we may not achieve success in life, or we may not lead a fulfilled life. We might fear this. Of course, this is also easy to. Sorry, the video cut off there for some reason. So as I was saying, this is also very easy to. This point is very easy to argue with, because we can immediately think of many people who died young, but they've led a very fulfilled life, a very rich life, as well as We can think of lots of people who died very old, but they never did anything noteworthy, right? Besides the ideas of what is a fulfilled life or what is success, these are very vague. So this point is also not a very good argument against Epicurus' thoughts. Number 3, we fear the pain that may accompany the process of dying. And this is where it sort of gets tricky, right? Because pain, it quite obviously is a sensory experience. And I'm certain that Epicurus will concede that a fear of pain is a very legitimate fear for a person to have. We as humans have a very valid fear of experiencing pain. It's an evolutionary reason, right? It's so that we don't put our bodies and minds in undesirable situations. But although I feel that Epicurus might have agreed with this, I must say that this point of pain has nothing to do with his argument against fear of death, because it's not a fear of death, it's a fear of pain, right? We may as well have called it just that. Because indeed, during a traffic accident, for example, we are not afraid of dying. We are afraid of the pain and of the injuries that we may sustain. When you incur a very serious illness, we are afraid not of dying, but of the pain of the symptoms. And we may argue, of course, that these are legitimate fears that one might possess during the process of dying as well, so therefore it should be included. However, these pains and these discomforts can also be experienced outside of the situation of death, right? In situations that are not associated with death as well. It is possible to experience pain even though you are not dying, right? So therefore these fears do not really belong under the umbrella of death in and of itself. They belong in a separate category altogether. So what then must we make of these fears, and where do they fit within this paradigm of Epicureanism, right? Can we still use these to counter his arguments somehow? And the thing is, Epicurus never dismissed these as non-existent, and in fact, freedom from discomfort and pain and of the fear thereof is quite central to his idea of ataraxia, right? We already know that, but he acknowledges that these are valid points that we must work on removing from our lives, yes, and he also explains how one may do so, though we need not get into that part right now. What he says is simply this: death is not something to be feared. And the more I think about it, the more I realize he's right. Semantically, he's correct. Whatever we are actually afraid of when we say we fear death are the fears of the pains and discomforts that are not strictly or solely restricted to death. And I had discussed this whole sequence of arguments with a friend of mine, and it sort of ended with us agreeing that it's all in the semantics. Because if we look at death in and of itself, the moment of death, the phenomenon of non-becoming, that is not worthy of fear. But most people do not look at it that way. We extrapolate death backwards in time, from that moment of death to a certain point backwards, and we call that whole thing as death, that whole time period. But then how far back in time are you allowed to do this? It's very subjective, right? This makes it very hard to argue for or against this. So I won't call it wrong, but it isn't correct either. If a person dies 2 years after being diagnosed with terminal cancer, okay, how long was the death in this case? Was the death 2 years long, right? How do you define when the death began? Is it the moment that the cell mutated and took hold, which you don't even know when that was, right? Is it the moment of diagnosis? Is it the moment that the doctor came out of the room and he said, there's nothing more we can do? Is it the moment of the final hospitalization? The last moment that they had any consciousness in their mind? Or is it the instant that the cardiogram goes flat? It's hard to go down this path and still make a good argument, because it's very subjective. It's not defined at all. So whatever it is, I think we can still learn something from this stream of thought, I think that we all unconsciously give a lot of power to the idea of death. The apparent futility of our lives leads us to feel that death is always victorious in the end. And that is why we give it a very negative connotation. Life is good, death is bad. You don't often hear giggles at a funeral, let's just put it that way, right? So this makes us engage in very fearful and anxious thoughts and behaviors about these. And these fearful acts and thoughts are often illogical and foolish because they distract us from things that we actually ought to worry about and ought to act upon in our lives right now. And of course, Epicureanism as a school of thought, as a philosophy, deals with so much more, a very vast array of topics. And this is only one very specific point that I just want to talk about. But it is a useful course of thought to keep in mind when trying to lead a better life. I think it's useful. The famous Christian theologian, Saint Paul, he challenges, O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? Very nice words. It's a dazzling, undying reminder in our lives that some things only have as much power over us as we allow them to have. So it's not just about death. Death is the extreme most example. Let's just remember that freedom from unnecessary fears and worries of any sort, it keeps us a few steps closer to that divine and godly state of Ataraxia. I guess that's what I was trying to arrive at. So yeah, if you've listened till the end, till here, thank you. Bye.